The presentation is called Ilyenkov's Cry from the Heart. Correspondingly, the cliche of a woman having to be emotional, I guess. This is a defense of Ilyenkov's book, Leninist Dialectics and the Metaphysics of Positivism. Thinking about it today, on this day, 12th of November 2022, we're talking about three different periods of history. We're talking about today, Ilyenkov's time, 78, 79, when he was writing this book, and Lenin in 1909, 8 to 9, when he was writing his book, which Ilyenkov was writing about. So we're going through three time zones, all of which have incredible moments of crisis. Lenin's time was the defeat of the 1905 revolution. Ilyenkov's time was, as David explained yesterday, the aftermath of 68 and the Brezhnev stagnation period before Gorbachev years. And our time, which you all know, the crisis that exists now. So I think the struggles of those over this book of Ilyenkovs are a kind of exemplar or symbol of this dialectical relationship between the historical and the logical. Lenin's time, Ilyenkov's time, and our time. So, and I want to explain that Ilyenkov did not stop developing after the year 1968, and he continued to have the courage of thought to challenge the ruling ideologies of his own time, both East and West. And that was why when he was offered this commission to celebrate Lenin's book, he grabbed it. He was frenetically writing it, and you can read about this in my full paper in Andrei Medensky's fantastic website, the memoirs of Ilyenkov's closest friends and colleagues. And they're very dramatic. I mean, I didn't even know they were there, and you can translate them with Google Translate them in Russian, but it's not a problem. And in my full paper, I've put some of them there. So this was to be Ilyenkov's very last major contribution, and before his death in 1979, and it was published a year or two after he died. And the way he was asked to write it, and the way it was edited, the way it was renamed, and then eventually published, as with virtually all of his writings, is an incredible story in itself. I think David mentioned some of this yesterday. And his very close friend, the philosopher Mikhailov, which David, I believe, met when he was still alive, and his colleague Grigory Vodolazov, who I hadn't heard of, actually describe in these memoirs what happened at that time. But just to summarize it, Visa Oitinen summarized Ilyenkov's intentions with this book, and I quote, Ilyenkov felt that Soviet society was going astray in the 1970s, forgetting the humanistic and cultural ideals of socialism. The intention, that's his intention, was to demonstrate what Lenin really said and to turn this against the actual Soviet society of his own time as it existed in Brezhnev's time. This is Oitinen. So it was not surprising that his manuscript, the original one, caused a huge stir. What Ilyenkov does, he draws out the essence of Lenin's philosophical battle within the Bolshevik Party at the time of this aftermath of 1905, the revolution that was drowned in blood. And he wants to provide, he sets out to provide a very clear and as simple as possible understanding of the theory of knowledge in contrast to the prevailing positive outlook that was very dominant at that time. So his thrust is to present the process and practice of cognition, the theory of knowledge, how we grasp reality. And in doing this, he champions materialist dialectics, which I'm putting in quotes. I'm saying materialist dialectics because Ilyenkov does use that term, and he doesn't very often use dialectical materialism. And this is also translation issues, which we don't know about. So he never mentioned, I mean, he doesn't refer to diamat. He's clearly against that. He doesn't much talk about dialectical materialism. He the term. So Lenin's book is often viewed as just a rude polemic with no dialogue. But Ilyenkov, I think Rodney referred to this in his talk, he punctures this myth of two Lenins, according to which it said that Lenin was very ignorant of dialectics and Hegel until 1914, when he did the philosophical notebooks. But it's a myth that's perpetuated even to this very day, and it's easily disprovable. And it goes alongside the attacks on Lenin's crude reflection theory. And this is something that Zizek is very fond of doing, along with others, where they merge the latter day dogmatization of Lenin with Lenin himself. But Ilyenkov emphasizes the dialectic process, the process itself as a process, as a unity, conflict, interpenetration, and transformation of self-related opposites, which is ontology and epistemology as they relate to each other. So thus thought develops in relation to its object, and the object also develops in relation to thought. But for Ilyenkov, as for Lenin, this object of cognition exists independently of the individual and the collective sensation and consciousness. So the object, as we talked about, may be a real object, a physical object, or an ideal object. And as we discussed, it's better to see it as a process rather than a fixture. And so in his book, he defines dialectics as, I quote, the totality of the forms of natural and social development in its universal form, and further, the system of laws of emotion and cognition. And he describes the essence of this relationship as follows, I quote, and this is from the book: dialectics consists in not only being able to define matter as such, it can only be defined through its opposite, and only if one of the opposites is seen as fixed, as primary, and the other arises from it. So what is the opposite of this matter? What is it? Well, it's of course, it's consciousness. So in this way, he makes a very clear distinction between materialism and idealism, and this is something that many people have a big problem with. But I'll just quote again: for materialism, matter, the objective reality given to us in sensation, is the basis of the theory of knowledge, epistemology. And at the same time, as for idealism of any type, the basis of epistemology is consciousness, unquote. So Ilyenkov is talking about journeys. He's not talking about fixtures, journeys of consciousness and thought. And I'm going to quote again, sorry about all these quotes. It is also not true that the world is cognized in our sensations. Referred back to discussion with Yannis just now. In sensations, the external world is only given to us just as it is given to a dog. It is cognized not in sensations, but in the activity of thought, the science of which is, after all, according to Lenin, the theory of knowledge of contemporary materialism, unquote. So the activity of thought, according to Ilyenkov, is the opposite of a reductive theory of reflection. And that relationship with the object of our activity, or the process of our activity, must be, and I'm quoting Spinoza here, I don't know if Ilyenkov does actually, but Spinoza says under the aspect of eternity, which I mean, I don't know about everybody else, but I think it's one of the most beautiful expressions in philosophy, because it embraces both the infinite and the eternal in a sense. So, but in Ilyenkov's terms, the activity of thought is a dialectical part of the universal motion of matter and thought. And importantly, this relationship is both absolute and relative. So it's not absolutized, nor, well, it's both. So therefore, you have this theory of knowledge, which is a dialectic between the universal, the individual, and the particular. And that we've been discussing this the last couple of days. So, but by emphasizing these distinctions, he integrates his concept of the ideal, and this comes into the book, into this last book, which he worked on in previous years, reinterpreting Hegel's immortality of the spirit and Ilyenkos as the aggregate spirit of humankind. So he humanizes and deconstructs Hegel's absolute spirit as the aggregate spirit of mankind. And he does that quite early in the book. Just to sum up, developing a concrete objective understanding of phenomena is through the activity, the practice of thought in relation to its object, and it takes place in time and space. And this involves dialectical logic, tracing the journey between the self-related opposites of semblance, appearance, and essence. For those who haven't read The Science of Logic, these are Hegelian terms, and they are self-related contradictory moments of cognition. And that means we grasp that our knowledge is relative to any historical moment, whilst at the same time that through our practical activity, we can prove the materiality of our thought. In fact, the reality, the correctness, truth of our thought. So that is through the coincidence of dialectically derived and negated, which is not the same as derived, sublated moments, concepts, the coincidence of those concepts with the absolute and relative nature of the moment of practice, which must be a moment in time. That's sort of the end of just trying to work on Ilyenkov's book, but I wanted to bring that in relationship with our discussion the last day or so, because I think a lot, very much missing from our discussions is that further work on this essence of dialectics, materialist dialectics, and that is the concept of self-movement. And in nature and society and thought, this concept is vital. And it runs through all these aspects and these different sides of the world and cognition. And we can see that as the kind of self-related unity of difference, as well as difference of ontology and epistemology. And as Yanis said yesterday, there's a difference within the unity and vice versa. So we're not talking about a totality without difference. The totality that's riven and contradictory and with moments of interruption. But it's this internal self-movement the internal contradictions within the processes, within logic, within thought, that bring about the self-movement. And I think when Ezekiel yesterday spoke about autopoiesis, I don't know how to pronounce it. He spoke about in human social development, but I think we can think about it in a wider sense, because it's the arising of something new. He explained how through collective practical discussion work, something new arises that wasn't there before. So, but I think that it's important to see that as a moment of transformation, that it is something truly new. It's not just a repetition or a further development. There's a leap, and something new can arise. And some, people talk about being in the zone. I think that's the sort of feeling that you're getting that impetus, that energy from the self-movement that you've embodied in yourself and in your thought. So I think David, I was trying to find it like that. I think in the space of reason, you talk about the transformation idea of a human being. I couldn't find the reference, but anyway, in relation to personhood and development of personality, and the idea of a second nature, which is a transformational moment, and at least I see it like that. I mean, I'm actually not a parent. I think when a child begins to speak, when a child recognizes itself in the mirror as itself, these are moments of transformation, and moments of interruption. Something new in that being has taken place that wasn't there before. So it's a transformation of an unconscious being into a conscious being through self-reflection and reflection into others, to seeing itself in others. So I'm nearly done. That's a little bit more. So just concluding, I don't think Ilyenkov gave up. He was clearly very troubled, but he didn't give up. And before this book that I'm talking about, he did write a long essay on the dialectics of the ideal. I'm not sure of the date, but it was in the mid-70s. And it was just as controversial, even if not more so, as his original explosive theory, theses that he published in the 50s, called the enormous ruptures. And in that long essay, which was never published till very recently in its full form, he insists on thought as a dialectically contradictory activity. That's why it's called the dialectics of the ideal. And that thought that the ideal is objective and it is independent of the individual, and that we are biological beings, social beings, and thinking beings. So just, as Lenin said about Hegel, activity is a contradiction. Your purpose is real and not real at the same time. You're trying to achieve something that's not been there, that hasn't existed, that's both possible and not possible. So it's open, it's an open question. And I don't think this is just the rising of the new through a leap from the not real to the real. Is not just something in thought, it's just in biological evolution. And I just want to reference Stephen Jay Gould, who in the 70s, before Ilyenkov wrote this, only a few years, 72 it was published, he explained the relative leaps and sudden explosions in these biological evolution, where suddenly you'd have a slow development, suddenly an explosion of species, which is actually still being challenged, but he called that punctuated evolution, or punctuated equilibrium. I think we can see that in human and individual and development of thought. So just to sum up, a social being and social consciousness, they're also self-related opposites, and they also have their own contradictions. And these are important for today's world, because there are huge contradictions in social ideals, and they bleed. We're seeing now these breaks in continuity, these leaps and interruptions, and the ideal of a national ideal, the ideal of democracy. And they're driving development now in a very traumatic and shocking and problematic way. And I just want to take in what Sergei said about alienation, and picking up from Rodney that the underestimation of the phenomenon of alienation in today's society, and how it has been exploited and how it's been picked up and used by the far right and fascism. And I think the question that Sergei raises, how do we make that something for us? That's the big challenge for now, I think. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Corinna. Yeah, first, just to support what you were saying, just to make the link to Ezekiel's presentation. So the more famous theory by Macerano and Varela is still very much in the Spinoza's universe, where autopoiesis, the criticism of it is it assumes this sort of whole structure that's just entirely self-contained. And what Ezekiel was showing, that it's not a circle, it's actually a spiral. But his model is exactly to take autopoiesis and turn it into a spiral, and that's actually what that's the result of what your suggestion, yeah, I think is important. So any comments or questions for so very much not for verification.
Two quick questions. One, is this the last book that either not being translated or the translation into English is very,
It's been translated. I just talked to you.
it's very kind of authorized, isn't it?
Well, I mean, this is the. Maybe David will know, don't you?
Corinna's just looking for
I'm
the,
just looking for the original translation because it's so beaten up copy.
All right, Leninist Dialectics, yeah. Is that,
That's not the title that Ilyenkov chose.
right? I think, did my dad, did I do my dad give a contribution about?
Well, my Dunsky
work
thinks
on-
his message doesn't come across in it, but I actually do think his message comes across. But you have, sorry.
I'm here.
Hello, Andrew. I mean, I think that if you read it with understanding the context, it speaks. And it's very interesting. Olga Ivachuk, who is a supporter of our friends who couldn't come because of the situation in Russia, but sent her greetings. She told me that this is the only book that hasn't been discussed at the Ilyenkov reading. So it's anathema somehow, but it was his last book. Was that your question?
Kind of, it's, yeah, my question really is that
Yeah.
book.
But it'd be nice to get the original as well.
And I just another quick one, which is that, did you say that Ilyenkov was saying that materialism is matter taken as given in sensation? And that's the root of the well, the question is, if given that definition of materialism, to what extent then was Kant a materialist?
Well, I mean, we're talking about reductive crude materialism, or we're talking about materialist dialectics. Because reductive, I think came up in a previous, maybe in Yanism, or somebody mentioned it, but it came up in Martin's. This, the animists, for them matter is just immediate. I mean, the world of nature is unmediated. And then, the way he was explaining the animist religion was, it's complete idealism, as you said. It's a kind of, but I mean, this is the whole thing about materialist dialectics, that you're not talking about. You can't just take in matter. If we're talking about thought, it's a complex process of mediation. But I don't know if that answers it. Probably not.
Go.
Hi. So I have I don't know, don't you offer? Okay.
Oh, yeah, sorry. You can do that.
So when this is a question that I'm sure will reflect my immense ignorance of everything. But when I talk to analytic philosophers in the Anglophone universities, and they hear people talking of positivism, the reaction is just one of bafflement. Right? Their attitude is, well, positivism, like, we stopped believing in that stuff in the 1950s. Why are you still talking? So I guess my question would be, right, is there a sense of positivism that would justify Ilyenkov's use of it and maybe justify why we're still talking about it now in 2022? Or should Ilyenkov have used different words? I guess I'm sort of, like when I talk to my Anglophone colleagues, I get these kinds of responses, like, what are you talking about that? That's, it's not what I've done 100 years ago. I'm sort of curious, like, how would you advise I respond to my colleagues? Put that way.
I think David should.
I don't think I'd like your responses from both of you, to be honest.
Well, I mean, positivism goes back to the French Comteans in it was the rise of science in the late 19th century, and it was kind of this, you could call it idealist materialism, where science was made like a god. And I think that's the kind of legacy that Ilyenkov was also, and Lenin, when in the fight in his struggle against the Machists and Bogdanov, it was this elevation. They said, oh, all we need is science now, get rid of all the philosophy, you don't need that, you just have science.
So in that sense, that's a quick follow-up there. So would that, in that sense, with a more appropriate contemporary term, be scientism?
Yeah, I think so.
But however, in Corinna's paper, one thing she does highlight, again, drawing on Andre, who will speak next, is the sense in which the conversations about Marxism were quite specific critiques of the Stalinist stagnation in that society. A lot of the Marxism was seeing Bogdanov as like avatar for Stalinism.
Yeah.
I think that's give the word to Andre.
Oh, well, he's speaking next, so we can ask him various things.
But what did you mean was unfair?
Oh, I mean, I want to talk.
Yeah.
Give me the altar, please. So, hi, Andre. So, I guess, I mean, in your paper, you, in the written version, you, I don't know, couldn't tell that mine, you, which is kindly left out. Your presentation, because in Positivism Revolution, and in the later publication, like they well, materialism and empiricism was something of a disaster for the culture and philosophical inquiry in the Soviet Union because of the incredible polemical tone that is taken in that book. So you mentioned that I knew Felix and Krylov, and in fact, Felix mentored one of those in Moscow. I spent hundreds of hours talking with him, and so it's interesting to see the quotations that you have him, because I remember discussing this book with him, and he said to me, "Look, David, you gotta read this book right. You gotta understand that it's a critique of positivism as it is, or scientism, technologism, as it is instantiated in contemporary, so life. So, the critique of Bogdanov is just a way of getting at a contemporary situation, and that shed a lot of interesting light on what's going on in the text, because it's a curious book. It's fragmentary reading. I mean, that's a noble sort of cause, and it fits sort of with what I was saying yesterday about some of the things that Ilyenkovs work. But it is a shame that Bogdanov, who was an absolutely brilliant thinker, is used again as kind of the fall guy for this. And I mean, recently, lots of Bogdanov's stuff has been published in the program, and that's book series has a number of translations of his work. And I mean, this isn't not my style of philosophy, because it's form of Marxist empiricism, very characteristic of the early 20th century. But it's, you can see that there is a real mind at work in Bogdanov's work. This is not someone wanting to write them. So it's just the whole polemical structure of all of this. I find quite disturbing.
It is disturbing, but in my full paper, I have a footnote there. There's a very, very good review of these two new books on Bogdanov by I don't forgotten his name, in Marxism and Philosophy Review of Books. I've forgotten his name, but if you look in my paper, I'd reference him, where he talks kind of who Bogdanov was. I mean, he died tragically, experimented on a blood transfusion and killed himself. And he was made in charge of you know, in the 20s, he was in charge of this big institute. So he wasn't deposed, you know, he was quite powerful in terms of his own field. I mean, I agree, you know, it became a caricature, didn't it? This whole thing. But, you know, that's why I said a cry from the heart. You feel this desperation, you know. Yeah.
Okay, what we'll do is just bring Rodney in, then have a 5-minute break and bring Andre in as well. Okay, so Rodney first.
Oh, I just wanted to say really quick that one of the problems that we face here is a very old, I would say, not too productive tradition in Marxist philosophy, is that of, you know, completely destroying your opponent. So, for example, you know, you get the anti-dueling of Engels and the critique of Marx to Proudhon, and here Lenin against Bogdanov, and they are very harsh in their critiques. And, you know, the tradition that comes after that usually think that, you know, Bogdanov was this imbecile and Lenin was the genius, and that's of course wrong. However, I still think that sometimes Lenin's book, you know, the 1908 book, Materialism and Empirio-criticism, is sometimes treated in an unfair way. Of course, I can see that the main purpose of that book is defending materialism from the general point of view, not precisely from the dialectical point of view. And there are some aspects, despite of that, that we should pay attention to, such as the problem of truth. I think that Lenin has a very interesting idea of truth, not only, you know, the old Aristotelian version of the, you know, the correspondence theory, but also the problem of the asymptotic movement of humanity towards truth, in the sense that we are closer and closer, but we never actually reach the absolute truth. So I think that I would like to say is that sometimes Lenin, the philosophical Lenin, not the politician, is diminished or overlooked. And I think that we also have to pay attention to his philosophical notebooks and so on. In the end, Lenin is also an interesting figure, not only in politics, but also in philosophy. And Ilyenkov saw that.
Thank you. Okay, so let's say